Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we are returning to the core theme of this podcast series, and this is busting myths and taking a closer look at overly convenient truths, those that are too good and too fantastic to be true. The list of these myths is endless, which really is a good thing because it means we can continue with the podcast series for a long time. Of course, one has to pick and choose what myths to bust. And in this episode, we will take a closer look at some of the more famous or perhaps infamous myths from both the Western and the Eastern Front. Hi Jesse, good to be back, good to see you and to hear you. And here we are once again looking at myths and busting them. As we said, this is what we do in this podcast. And let's start with perhaps one which I know is quite close to your heart because you suggested it. That sounds very wrong because it's all about drugs and drugs taking. So listeners, please don't get the wrong idea here. But we talked about this and Jesse said, well, that would be really interesting to look at how drugs influenced the war and the campaigns. We probably all know that drugs did play a massive role. Look at, for example, at Hitler towards the end when he's sitting in the bunker. He is basically a drug cabinet on legs. He's completely drugged up by his Dr. Morell. However, there are, of course, other aspects of drugs and drug taking as well. So perhaps, Jesse, because you really want to talk about this, if I throw the drugs over to you, don't take them all at once, but talk us through some of your ideas, your thoughts, and why you think this is a very interesting and important aspect to look at.
Well, I think the myth is important. The question of how important the drugs were is one that we're going to unpack a little bit here. And I have to admit my inspiration for choosing this topic. By the way, listeners, we're not just going to talk about drugs. We're again going to sample a few of the different myths as we did in our very first episode because we had a lot of fun doing that and your feedback was positive. But the first one is drugs, right? Not that, kids don't do drugs out there. Let's just get that out of the way first. But I think one of the reasons why I wanted to include this in our myth selection and our myth dissection is because of YouTube comments. Now, as some of you listeners might know, I work quite a bit on YouTube, so I'm often exposed to the ups and downs of the comment section, which can be quite interesting and rewarding, and which can also show you the depths of the dregs of humanity, depending. I won't get into the proportions between those two, but yeah, it can go in both extremes. And several years ago, I'm not going to name names, but several years ago, there was quite a popular history book that came out about drug use in the German army and their use of stimulants, in particular one known as Pervitin, especially during the earlier campaigns, especially during the campaign in France. And many people took away from this book, perhaps exaggeratedly, but nonetheless, many people took away from this book the idea that stimulants being consumed by German army soldiers and officers in the field were a major component, if not the major component, in why the German army was able to win the campaign in the Low Countries in France in 1940. So that's the myth that's out there. I've even seen comments on our own video on Real-Time History, on the Real-Time History channel, our own video about the France 1940 campaign. Several commenters wrote, this is a worthless historical documentary because you don't talk about the real reason the Germans won, which was drugs. Now, Matthias, take your historical hatchet to this idea. Where does it come from? Is there a grain of truth in some of it? And how can we assess this claim that it was a determining factor in the 1940 campaign?
As always, when you look at history, and I've said this before many times, I think there's a lot of gray rather than complete black and white. And drugs, particularly in the early stages of the war, they do play a role. But as you've already mentioned and as you've alluded to, they're by no means as decisive as many people think, even today. And you talked about this, and you mentioned the comments. So let's perhaps look at what this drug, the main drug, the pervitin that you mentioned. What is this? Where does it come from? And why does it play a role? So pervitin, for those of you who are interested in the chemistry behind it, is basically an early version of crystal meth. Most people have probably heard of this. So it's a stimulant. It keeps you going. It gets you in a good mood. It makes you less tired. So you might say in many ways, it's the perfect stimulant for a military campaign. It doesn't make you feel pain as much. So why not use it? Where does it come from? Well, it's invented by the Germans, by a company called Temmler, which is based in Berlin at the time. After the war, it then keeps moving to lots of different places and ends up in West Germany. And it's invented by a man called Fritz Hauschild. And it's patented in 1938. And from 1938 all the way to 1988, this drug is produced. So you can see that's a long, long time. And obviously, people are taking it. Why is it then introduced into the army, and how is that? Well, there is a man, he's called Otto Ranke, and he's the director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Science. And he runs a number of experiments. He gets 90 students together, drugs them up, and sees what the consequences are. And the consequences are, as I've already said, people are less tired, they can perform for longer, and they just take it and they think, you know what, this might work really well. We need to understand the context here. So this is now the 1930s. Of course, when we hear the word drugs and crystal meth and pervitin, the big red cross comes out. That's all a no-go. That was all very different in those days. In the 1930s, most of these drugs are actually widely and freely available. People were experimenting with all sorts of things. Perhaps the most famous example is, of course, Coca-Cola, which had lots of interesting ingredients in those days. So this idea that drugs per se are a bad thing was not that widespread. You also, of course, have, particularly in Europe, a lot of people who are dependent on drugs, who've become drug addicts because they have been wounded in the First World War. So there are a lot of these people, and they really take a lot of drugs. So there's a very, very different attitude to drug taking. So they then decide to introduce this. And when the war breaks out, they hand them out to the troops, in particular, not only, but in particular to the tank crews and those people fighting in the tank divisions. The reason behind that is that this is the spearhead of the German army. These are the ones that really need to push into the enemy lines and advance and move forward. And when you take these pills, you can actually go up to, well, it depends really on your body, but up to 3 days without sleep. If you're an infantryman, the statistics at the time tell us you can march up to 60 kilometers without a rest. So that's all very, very impressive. And you can begin to understand why they think this is very, very useful. However, and this is where the myth comes in, even at that stage, they do realize, of course, there are side effects, and it comes at a price. The first price is when you take it to the pure military level, you can operate for 3 days, but after 3 days, you're completely spent. And then you need a longer period of rest. You can't go endlessly on these drugs and keep on going. You need some sort of rest. So it's quite useful for short bursts, for short operations. For example, also the Air Force crews take it when they fly in the later stages, for argument's sake, over London. In the evening, you are tired, you take one of these pills, and there we go. But they already quite early on realize that this is not the solution to the blitzkrieg, if you want to use that term. We've talked about this in a different episode. So it doesn't really solve anything long term. So you need to factor all these things in. And also when you take it to the bigger picture and take it back to society, the Nazis actually have a lot of understanding and conduct a lot of research into the human body, into what is healthy for the human. And they realize quite quickly that these things in the long term are not healthy. And from 1941 onwards, you're no longer able to get pervitin without prescription. That does not apply to the military, where they still hand them out. However, the use of the drug there also reduces as the war goes on, for exactly the reason I've just mentioned. However, when you look at the sheer numbers, there are quite a lot of them. So, if, for example, in April and May 1940 alone, German industry produces 35 million of these doses. That does not mean that 35 million of them get used in these 2 months, but you can understand what the whole idea behind that is. And of course, it's not the only drug that you find. There are others. One of the famous ones, not as strong, one that can actually still buy today in German supermarkets, is Coca-Cola, which also became known as the pilot's pill, because that was given to pilots, again, when they're on their missions. It's chocolate, which gives you energy, and you also have a relatively high level of caffeine in there. So that is still available today. To be honest, I'm not quite sure if it's as strong as it was in those days. But you can see there they're experimenting with different ideas, because they have realized at that stage already that pervitin is not the solution to the problem. So that was a very long burst. So Jesse, you want to talk about this, so back to you.
Well, I think what I find interesting about the concept that people take away from it is, I think there's a sense among some people who've been exposed to this idea that it was a complete novelty, and therefore it gave the Germans an operational advantage in this campaign that they won. But of course, using stimulants of some kind or drugs of some kind in conjunction with military activity was also not new. So you pointed out the general context in the 1930s, the legal context, the social context about drugs was different. But militaries using drugs, this was not necessarily something completely new. I mean, just think of good old British Army service rum that might get distributed before an attack, before going over the top in the First World War, for example. So the idea that you would give something, a substance to soldiers to improve their performance in some way, be it as a stimulant, be it liquid courage, so to speak, to dull their anxiousness and fear, it's not necessarily completely revolutionary, although of course 35 million doses in a couple of months is quite a high amount. The question I have is, if this were so important that it allowed Germany to defeat France, as the exaggerated version of the myth goes, well, what changed in 1941, in 1942? I mean, if it were so great, they could have just taken it all the way to Moscow, riding a pervitin high all the way to the Kremlin, right? I think, what I'm trying to do here is put it into context that in war making, something like a stimulant that soldiers are taking, it's one part of a very, very large puzzle. And many other pieces of that puzzle, in my opinion, are larger and more significant than the stimulants. It doesn't mean it has zero impact on a tactical situation or what one unit might be able to do in one night, for example, but it's not necessarily going to be the thing that makes the difference in a wider campaign that lasts 6 weeks or 3 months or 4 months or what have you. And I think that's where I really have a bone to pick with some of the people who've adopted this myth, let's say. The other thing that comes to my mind all the time when I think about this is, well, if pervitin was really a sort of a campaign winning factor, where's the evidence for that? Do we have German army reports saying pervitin won us this battle? Our commanders couldn't have imagined doing what they did without pervitin, etc., etc. I don't think there's that kind of paper trail of evidence at that level saying that it had that kind of impact. Unless you've found one, unless you've got one in your private collection at home, dust it off and bring it to light here on our podcast. I beg of you.
Now I've got pervitin in my private collection.
Great.
No, I don't. There we are. I think you're absolutely right. So it can play a role when you look at the tactical level, when you need to perform for a day, for 2 days, for 3 days, because it gives you the ability to outmaneuver the enemy, to keep going, and to just outmaneuver the enemy, defeat the enemy by doing that. But as I've already said, it comes at a price. And they knew that it comes at a price. So if you then go into an operation, into a campaign that lasts several weeks, several months, several years, you can't keep people going on drugs the whole time. I mean, just look at the drug problem and look at drug addicts. it simply doesn't work. Well, you don't have a useful, a competent fighter that is completely drugged up. You look at, I mentioned Hitler earlier, you look at Morel, his private physician. So when you look at Hitler and some of the decisions that he takes towards the end of the war, some people have argued, well, the reason why he takes so many wrong decisions is actually because he is completely drugged up. And so he's a drug addict by that stage. As I said, there were lots of them. Goering is one of them. He takes quite a lot of drugs, again, because of the First World War. So there's a lot of that, but it does not mean that this becomes the battle-winning remedy. It could be an engagement-winning remedy, so at the smaller tactical level, 1 or 2 days, but after that, not really. And I think that's really what they realized. So if you really have to give these things to people, yes, well, pop a pill and then you fly to the UK and drop your bombs and then you come back. But that is pretty much it. After that, you do get some rest. And I think that really is the important issue here.
Now, that being said, you couldn't have given the Italian army Pervitin and turned them into the German army either. So there are other factors in there as well. But all jokes about the Italians aside, that is in fact the next myth that we wanted to tackle today. The Italian military. The idea that the Italian military in World War II was absolutely good for nothing, a laughingstock, and never performed worth mentioning on the battlefield. In fact, this is such a well-anchored caricature, I think, that even at the time, I forget which episode we were working on at some stage for a YouTube video, but we found a great quote from a German officer when the Americans first arrived in Tunisia in North Africa in 1943. You know, they had some problems with their performance as inexperienced troops with some inexperienced commanders. And a German officer said, well, the Americans are Britain's Italians. And so to me, that sums up this myth, this idea that the Italians were completely worthless militarily in World War II. Now, it must be said, I want to kind of get us into this topic by saying there is a grain of truth to this. And I think that comes as no huge surprise. The Italian army did not perform among the elite militaries, let's say, of the Second World War. It struggled when they invaded France in 1940. It struggled when they invaded Greece later that year. It struggled in North Africa before the Germans came and lent a hand. It struggled in Ethiopia in 1940. And then, of course, there's the final collapse that occurs rather quickly in 1943. So there is, I think here we're working with a half myth, let's say, to some extent. But nonetheless, I think when you scratch under the surface and you really look at different situations, different aspects of the Italian army, it's not that simple. I think that's a fair start.
I think you're absolutely right. And there is, of course, a kernel of truth in this, as you've already said. But as I keep saying, there is more grey than black and white when it comes to history. The Italians, of course, have a relatively bad reputation in both world wars, you might say. I know we're not supposed to be talking about the First World War here because that's our sister podcast, but maybe just give you one quick example. There is the British defense attaché in Italy who rides back to London while Italy's at war with Germany, and he says, well, I don't understand why we're fighting with these funny little Italians against these very good-looking German chaps. We should be doing it the other way around. Interesting enough, this caused a diplomatic incident only a few years ago when these notes were written out, and we had an Italian officer in the audience. It was a military conference, and of course he took great offense. That was all quite difficult, in retrospect, quite interesting, but at the time it was more difficult. So you do get that. You can go back to the famous quote from Napoleon, who apparently said, well, Italy doesn't finish the war on the same side it started it, unless the Italians switch sides twice. So you can see even at the strategic level, they're seen as unreliable, not trustworthy, just basically not so good. Yes, there is some truth in it. And when you look at the strategic picture, you can try to understand why that is. One of the main reasons that you have is, of course, that Italy as a country is founded relatively late, only in the second half of the 19th century. Before that, you don't have united Italy. So it's a bit like Germany, a latecomer to the club of nations in Europe. And it's simple things, for example, language. Today we think that everyone spoke the same language, but it's far from it. I've got Italian relatives, and they tell me that it was, even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was quite difficult for someone from northern Italy to speak to someone from Sicily, because the language was very, very different, the accents, the dialects. So immediately you can begin to see that there are some structural issues, some problems here. It's also if you don't really see yourself as one country, and just look at what's going on in Italy at the moment. This idea with the Lega Nord, where the northern part of Italy wants to break away because they say we don't want anything to do with the mafia-ridden south. So all these problems were there at that time as well. And how can you create a functioning army out of a society that doesn't really function within a country? So these are perhaps the bigger issues that you find. When you then drill down and zoom in and you look at some of these troops, particularly those that were recruited from more regional areas, some of these actually performed really well. And perhaps the prime examples, the two here are the mountain troops, the Bersaglieri, and also when you go to North Africa, of course, we talked about North Africa, you have one particular division, the Ariete division, which when you look at the German accounts, that's actually praised. And you can see even the way Rommel uses this division. He thinks that that is a good division. Their equipment isn't great. It's all outdated. The tanks aren't good. The weaponry is very, very poor. But at least that division of Africa fights really well with it. And then, of course, and that's again where the grey comes in, you have other units that don't perform at all.
I think one of the shades of gray has to do with how do you break down the assessment of military value and military effectiveness? Are you talking about just the men? Are you talking about the military as an institution as a whole? Because, and the reason why that popped into my mind is you talked about the poor equipment that they had. The Italian soldiers are working at a disadvantage compared to the Germans or compared to the Brits or compared to the Americans and so forth, because their country, their country's industry, their army, their employer, if you will, in a sense, is not able to equip them for the job that they're being asked to do. And many troops from many different ethnic backgrounds, from many countries, don't perform particularly well when they're not equipped to do the job that they are asked to do. The Italians constantly suffered from poor logistics, not enough drinking water in Greece, not enough drinking water reached them in North Africa either on many occasions. Their tanks, as you alluded to, in the Ariete division were not up to snuff. The Italians themselves nicknamed the L3 tank the coffin. So, I mean, that's not a great sign when your own troops are nicknaming their own vehicles the coffin, right? They lacked winter uniforms when they were in Albania and Greece in 40-41. In that winter, some planes were sent to North Africa without even having proper filters to filter out the sand from the air intakes for the engines and so on. So I think that's a critical element that we need to keep in mind, so to speak, right? On the other hand, you have at the higher level, Mussolini making some very foolish decisions that also hamstring the army's ability to perform. So in 1940, he basically thinks the war is pretty much going to be over soon. He demobilizes several 100,000 men. But then he decides, almost on a whim, let's say, I'm going to invade Greece. So he recalls several 100,000 men to the military. I mean, as an officer yourself in the German military, you obviously have a pretty good idea of how much of a disruption that can be. When all of a sudden you've got units left and right dissolving or reducing strength, and then all of a sudden they've got to bring people back out of civilian life and go on a major operation.
That always causes issues. You're absolutely right. It is disruption at every single level. And I think in addition to all of this, what you also have is, of course, the factor of geography. So we always compare Italy to its mightier partner, of course, that is Germany. Germany is a completely different situation geographically. Say, to the Germans, it's all about the army. It's all about the land force. Everything else that happens is just in support of the land forces. In Italy, it's very, very different. In many ways and respects, it's the navy that is more important, because just look at the terrain, look at the country based in the Mediterranean. So you need to spend money on the navy, which is money that you don't have somewhere else. If you then decide to fight a land war as well, where do you get the resources from? It's not only Italy that's struggling with this. Just look, for example, at the British war effort in the Second World War. Britain is suffering similar issues, not that extreme because the country has more people, the country is richer, you've got an empire to support the country. Italy doesn't have that, and that makes it really difficult for the Italians. So if you identify the Mediterranean as the Mare Nostrum, as our sea, and you want to have control of the sea and the terrain around it, you practically need to have a very strong navy. And the Italian navy is not bad, actually. So they've got a number of very, very modern ships that they can use to very good effect. And for example, the frogmen that they have, I know it's only a small aspect, but these are world leading. And these mini submarines that they use are world class. But you also need to have an army that does the land fighting and the land component of the war. And that is a big problem because Italy as a country is simply not strong enough, not big enough, not rich enough to sustain these two different types of fighting. And that is a massive problem that you find in Italy strategically as well.
Yeah, on the topic of the Italian Navy, now I'm not generally a Navy guy, I have to say, but on a recent transatlantic flight, I watched a movie called Comandante. So if anybody is interested in a dramatic experience from the Italian Navy point of view in World War II, go ahead and check it out. It's kind of like the Italian Das Boot, let's say, where you follow a submarine crew. But I wanted to take this opportunity to point out a couple more examples of instances where the Italians fight well. Because if we're nibbling away at this myth that they were completely useless at all times, then I think that's a good way to go about doing it, in addition to trying to explain and put into context some of their weaknesses. So you mentioned the Ariete Division. Yes, on several occasions in North Africa, they performed quite well. On one occasion in late 1941, I think in November, they managed to stop a British armored force that had better tanks than they did. For example, they lose 40% of their tanks in that engagement, but they're able to stop the Brits in that area, which enables Rommel to execute some maneuvers that he wanted to execute elsewhere on the front line. So they're being used as a kind of a holding unit, taking heavy fighting in order to allow maneuver elsewhere. At El Alamein, for example, in late 1942, the Italians were most of the rear guard, trying to protect the German-Italian armies and allow them to retreat. And I think the British took something like 30,000 prisoners at El Alamein, 20,000 Italians, 10,000 Germans, even though, of course, the ratio of Italians to Germans in the overall Axis forces in North Africa was more than 2-1, most of the time anyway. So there again, they are fighting. They're not necessarily winning that battle, but they are fighting in the way one could expect a professional military to fight. Then even later in Tunisia, they caused some problems for the British on the Mareth line. For example, they even have then some German divisions under Italian command, one of the rare times. And they're doing this in Tunisia, 1943, without proper air cover. And here's another situation, I think, where context matters. What are you asking of these soldiers? No American soldier, for example, was ever asked to fight without air cover in World War II. And some of them would have certainly, many units would have performed more poorly without it. And here you have the Italians, in this particular case anyway, fighting relatively effectively in a losing campaign, it's true, without any air cover. I mean, that's a huge factor in how you can evaluate those types of situations. When Italy finally kind of falls, let's say in 1943, and now I'm moving on to this topic. This particular example is related a bit more, I think, to morale and the, let's say, honor, if you will, of the fighting force, because I thought it quite interesting. When Italy collapses in 1943, the Germans set up, or they allow Mussolini to continue on with a puppet state based in northern Italy. And then the Italian soldiers essentially have a choice to make. Do they go into German captivity as kind of enemies? Or do they join the army of the new German puppet Italian fascist state? And only 10 to 15% choose to join that puppet army. Most of them decided to take the chances, go into captivity, go into hard labor. Some of them end up in concentration camps. Some of them end up massacred in various smaller shootings, one famous one outside Berlin in 1945 near Treuenbrietzen, where the Germans execute 130 Italians, for example. So I feel like that's a bit different than fighting power and so on, but I feel like that is to the credit of the Italian army in a way. And as far as Rommel goes, I found an interesting quote from him because he did speak on occasion highly of the Italians. Now, it's true that they're allies, so politically, it's difficult for a German commander to the public anyway, to belittle the Italians, although in private, many, of course, did. But Rommel said this: the Italian soldier was full of goodwill, generous, a good comrade, and, considering the conditions in which he found himself, performed above the average. Many generals and officers earned our admiration in the human and the military sense. So I think there's something to that that's worth remembering when we think of all the memes and all the caricature style jokes about the ineffectiveness of the Italians. I don't know if you've got anything else to add. That was my sort of finale for the Italian side.
Maybe just one other point. When we compare the Italians, as we always do, in particular to the Germans, and we say, well, they couldn't really fight. Look at what the Germans are doing, and isn't that all much more heroic? Well, it might be more heroic what the Germans are doing, but look at the outcome of the war. So yes, Italy as a country sees quite a lot of fighting, Monte Cassino and other famous places. We don't need to go through all of them right now. But as a country on the whole, devastation that you see there is, of course, far less than what you, for example, find in Germany. So in many ways, you might argue the way the Italians fight is actually cleverer for them as a people and also for their country. And that also links, of course, back to the whole structure of the state that we talked about, and you mentioned it, and who's actually in charge. Yes, of course, well, we always look at Mussolini, who is the big fascist leader. But we quite often forget that above him there's a king. So there is the big difference here. Whereas in the German system, the soldiers had to swear a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler. That was not the case in Italy. And this is also when you look at the way that Mussolini falls and is then thrown out. So he is basically sacked by the king. And then he disappears. And as you said, the Germans bring him back and they have this fascist regime up in northern Italy. But so you can see there are different allegiances here at play as well. So you're not fixed and bound to one particular person, but it's more about the country. And if you then again say that really it's a bit of a broken country because it's not that united, even though on the map it is, but in reality it's not, you can begin to understand why the country fell apart, or the military forces, we should say, fell apart so relatively quickly in 1943. So did they perform well? Some of them did. And when they didn't perform all that well, I think there are some interesting explanations and reasons for that. And as always, I think it's really important that you look at the bigger picture stuff. Quite often when people do military history, they concentrate very much at what's happening at the sharp end. The tanks rolling into battle, the guns firing, and people getting killed. But that's only one side of the coin. There is so much more. And the modern definition of military history, for example, is also much, much wider. It's the action of the military forces within the context of society. And I think that plays a very, very important role. And once you start to understand Italian society and the structure of the Italian state at that particular time, you can begin to understand the performance, bad, good, grey, white, black, of the Italian forces in that particular war.
And moving away from the sharp end and onto the Allied side, our next myth for today, it's a myth that I think is not extremely widely held, but it's the kind of myth that I think is getting more attention and more traction these days. It trends on one side, I think, of the political spectrum to have a bit more appeal, and it's kind of been thrust into the limelight this year, thanks to a high-profile interview on a podcast that I won't name. But it's about Churchill. And this idea is that Churchill was a warmonger. He was, even perhaps in the words of some of the articulators of this myth, the villain, the chief villain of the Second World War, and responsible for escalating the war beyond the invasion of Poland. and refusing Hitler's offers of peace and insisting that Britain fight on, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to throw it over to you to get us into this, but I want to preface this by saying Churchill is obviously a flawed figure, like every other human who walks the planet, like every other human who has become a historical figure. He's obviously flawed. He can be criticized for all sorts of things, his imperialist type of way of thinking, his, by our standards today, egregious racism, his drinking, his switching parties multiple times in the course of his political career, or his strategic mistakes. There's no question that he's a very flawed figure. My great-grandfather, even according to family legend, served alongside him in Africa in British imperial ventures and hated his guts, right? So there's a lot to be there to be criticized about Churchill. And I think that the black and white, was he a hero or was he a villain, is not really our most valuable approach, right? But those caveats being as they are, how would you assess the general thrust of this idea that Churchill wanted war and then was responsible for refusing potential peace in the early years of the war?
Well, the first thing I want to say, when as you just said, well, everybody, of course, is flawed and has shortcomings. I would just like to exclude the two of us from that, because let's face it, we're completely flawed. Obviously, there we are. When we look at Churchill, and you've already said everything. He's a very difficult character. He has many, many flaws. And we're probably going to lose half of the audience here, I have to admit that I'm not a fan of Churchill. I think the flaws are more important than the shortcomings than his successes. Maybe we can do an extra podcast on that. One or two or 10. But let's leave it at that for the time being, because otherwise, we'll be talking about this forever. Did he want war? Did he not want war? Was he a warmonger? So to understand all this, you need to go back and look at the context to Churchill as a person, the relationship between the UK and Britain, questions of the empire, and of course the history between Germany and Britain, going all the way back to the First World War, actually before the First World War, is a difficult one. And Churchill, as a leading politician at that time, look at his role in the Royal Navy, for example, look at Gallipoli, all these things, he, of course, plays a vital role. And this shapes him. And so he's, I would argue, very, very critical and suspicious of whatever Germany does. I would argue sometimes overly critical and suspicious, but you can't blame him for that. So that's perhaps the first thing. And then you also need to understand, of course, the role that he plays in the interwar period, where he is... he's out of the political limelight, he is a nobody, and he knows exactly that, well, if he doesn't create a little area for himself where he can shine, then he's going to sink into oblivion. So very, very similar, you might say, to one of his successors who actually wrote a book about him, and so he was Prime Minister not that long ago, who falls very much into that same category. So very, very interesting parallels there. So he creates this idea that this is the drumbeat that he needs in order to create a voice for himself. But let's not forget then, when war breaks out between Britain and France on the one hand and Germany on the other hand, that's not because Britain wants to declare war, wants to go to war with Germany. It's because Germany has invaded Poland. And Britain and France have made it very, very clear that they're there to protect and guarantee the existence of a independent, democratic Poland. So it's a reaction to a German action. Now, you can then fast forward and say, what happens then? So Germany defeats Poland, Germany defeats France and the BEF. And yes, you already mentioned it, Hitler then gives a speech, of course, from a position of power, and he offers peace to Britain. And of course, the Brits, well, they don't even answer, because they said this is not really how this goes. Well, it's interesting. Had they made peace, I mean, it's a big what if. Would Britain still have an empire today? Potentially, but that's a different discussion to be had. But what do you do at this stage? Well, in the long run, if Germany hadn't invaded the Soviet Union, had remained a strong power in Europe, again, it's a very, very big what if, and we don't have the answer to that. My personal assumption is that at some stage Britain probably would have made peace, because they would have realized, well, you can't win. However, this would have gone against hundreds of years of British European politics, which was basically the politics and policy of balance. And that meant you did not want to have one major factor, one major country in Europe. And whenever you look at British history for the last several hundred years, this is exactly what the British did. Always fight the strongest opponent, whether it's the Dutch Republic, whether it's Spain, whether it's France, or whether it's Germany. So the history of British policy shows us that they would have done that anyway. And that's not necessarily only linked to Churchill. He, of course, becomes the dominant figurehead in this because it argued in a way for this for a long time. But the British establishment, to a large degree, would have supported this idea.
Well, I think the idea of the context of Churchill is important because in hindsight, he becomes a towering figure. So when talking about his responsibility for certain policies or for the course of the war in general, now it's very easy and appealing to see him as having massive, overwhelming influence over British policy. But as you say, he was in the political wilderness in the interwar period, for much of the interwar period. His warnings about Germany, now you assess them as having a little bit of a, let's say, self-promotion aspect to them. Maybe, but he was right. And yet, most of the British press and political establishment were not particularly supportive of that. Were not particularly interested in that for many years until 38, 39, Munich Agreement fails. German troops march into Prague and violate all the agreements that had been made, and then start talking about Poland. That's when British public opinion, British political leadership starts to wake up a little bit more. And Churchill then starts to have a bit more of a voice because his fears were justified. So in retrospect, saying he contributed to the coming of the war, he was not in power. He was not in power when war broke out. He only became prime minister basically on the day that the German army invaded France and the Low Countries. So how he gets ascribed the responsibility for the escalation of the war from a local invasion against Poland, which is a whole myth in itself, is beyond me. And I think this narrative or this idea that Churchill prolonged the war and it would have stayed local and Germany just wanted part of Poland, which is the assumption that was communicated in this infamous podcast this year, it ignores Hitler's intentions. And we've talked about them before in previous episodes. Hitler's planning on war in one form or another from the 1920s, from when he's writing Mein Kampf. And he reiterates that dedication to a war on many, many occasions. We've talked about them, as I said before. So the idea that, well, Hitler just wanted a piece of Poland, but then Big Bad Britain and Churchill, even though he wasn't even prime minister, are the ones who turned that into a world war, I find very hard to swallow because Hitler had plans for extending the war regardless. It would have been easier for Hitler if Britain and France had not declared war on him, if Churchill had not then been justified in his fears and then been given a leadership role. It would have been easier for Hitler, but he would have extended the war eastwards, in my estimation, in any case, deep into the Soviet Union, because that was the long-term plan. And you cannot hold Churchill, not you, of course, Matthias, but one cannot hold, I'm starting to lose my marbles here. One cannot hold Churchill responsible when, on the other hand, you have reams of historical evidence about Hitler's intentions for escalating and prolonging a war.
Well, not only historical evidence, but as you already said, you have this evidence right there at the time. Well, you just need to read Mein Kampf. It's all there. The problem, of course, with Mein Kampf is that's such a bad read that no one bothered reading it because it's so dull and boring. And the few people who've ever tried to read it, including myself, well, probably went nuts after a few minutes. So it is really a dull and boring read. And that's one of the problems. And yes, of course, well, Hitler had this idea. It's about living space in the East. And you might say up to 1941, to this 22nd of June, when they launched this invasion, everything for Hitler, in a way, you might argue, is a detour. So he needs to go into Poland because, first of all, there are territories that he and 95% of Germans at that time would have claimed that they need to go back to Germany. But then, to put it bluntly, Poland is just in the way. It's there in the way to go to Russia. And then, of course, you've got the declaration of war by France and Britain. And so they then need to look to the West to deal with that threat. And then you need to go into the Balkans because, as we already mentioned earlier, the Italian campaign doesn't go particularly well. And then they need to go into Scandinavia because, well, they get wind of the Allied operation there. And so they want to protect the shipping lanes and the natural resource. You can see how this is spiraling out of control for the Germans. It's only really in June 1941 that Hitler really gets the war that he wants. I would argue, when you read Mein Kampf, when you look at the actions of Hitler, that actually he wasn't all that keen on fighting with Britain. There is the story that when Britain finally declares war on Germany, and Hitler has brought this message on the 3rd of September 1939, France and Britain have declared war, that he has a nervous breakdown. He says, what are we going to do now? That was not the strategic intention that he had. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, it's from a pure military point of view. There's no need to fight Britain from his point of view because you want to go east. You need to defeat the Soviet army. Why do you need it? Why do you need to defeat the Soviet army? Well, that's where ideology comes in, of course, because they're all subhumans, they're Slavs, you need the living space. The Brits, of course, to him are very, very Germanic. So he takes it back to the influence of the Germanic people, the Germanic tribes who make their way across from modern-day Germany and Denmark and settle in Britain. So he says, from Nazi ideology, a racial point of view, these are brethren. We shouldn't be fighting against them. And when you look at what he says in Mein Kampf, he's very clear about this. He said what we should have is we should divide the world between the three powers. And the three big powers, well, that's Germany, getting the free hand in the East. That's Italy, because Germany is allied to Italy, and Hitler had this admiration for Mussolini. The Italians get the free hand in the Mediterranean, and Britain keeps the empire. That's what he was trying to achieve, and that's what he was trying to do in many ways. When you look at the grand strategic ideas and visions of Hitler, which, of course, really, really run into the ideas and confront the ideas of British general foreign policy. I already mentioned it, the balance of power in Europe, where according to this idea, we normally have five major powers in Europe. These keep shifting and changing. Some nations might rise, some might decline, but it's always five nations traditionally that divide the power within Europe. And the moment one power gets too strong, Britain will fight that particular power. So Hitler doesn't really understand how the British national psyche, for a better word, ticks. And that's a massive problem. That, of course, is one of the issues with Hitler, because he was not particularly well traveled. He's not particularly well educated. The problem of the entire Nazi regime. It's very difficult to find people who are actually well experienced, who've been out there, have seen how other countries function, how other countries work. So he sees everything through his very Nazi lens, of course. Ideology plays a role, race plays a role, and that's basically it. So he doesn't really understand how the nations work. And I think that's the underlying issue that you find here.
All right, to wrap up this myth about Churchill being responsible for the escalation of the war and being the primary villain of World War II, I think if Germany really didn't want war with the UK and France, they could have not invaded Poland. I mean, to me, that's what it boils down to. And I feel like this concept of assessing Churchill in this way, it just doesn't hold water. You can't hold Churchill's feet to the fire for policies that were enacted before he came into government and completely ignore Hitler's intentions, Hitler's agency, Hitler's long-term policies and ideology at the same time. So to me, it's not a particularly intellectually responsible way of looking at history. On that topic, let's get to our last myth for today. Given the time flies when you're getting all worked up about historical myths, as I am at the moment, I have to admit. And that is And I'm going to give the floor over to you, Matthias, here, because I think your expertise is what we really want to get at for this particular myth. There is an idea. I think it's more widespread in the German-speaking world than it is in the English-speaking world, but I've seen several references to it in the past couple of years, and that is that in 1941, the Soviet Union was actually planning this. This is the myth, right? This is the idea that the USSR was planning to attack Germany. And so Germany's attack on the USSR, Operation Barbarossa, can be considered a preemptive strike. I think this is a bunch of hogwash, but what do you think? You know the topic much better than I do, but go ahead.
In a nutshell, you're right. And we can finish right now and here. But of course, let's unpack this a little bit more. And why do people say this? Why do people argue that, as you say, it was a preemptive strike? I think there are a number of reasons. First, of course, it's a good excuse. You come up with this and say, well, we had to do this. And this is actually also the excuse that Hitler uses and the Nazis use. Well, we had to go in there. We had to take because they were getting ready to attack us, which is very confusing to everybody else, including the Germans, because at that stage, let's not forget, Germany has an alliance with the Soviet Union. Stalin is very confused when the Germans invade. So he has, again, a nervous breakdown, goes to his Dacia, not to be seen for quite some time. It's a very easy excuse. It's one that the German propaganda used quite, perhaps you might say, effectively at the time. And obviously, you can see the ripple effects, the shock waves of that still coming through to today. What you also have is another political level or angle to this, I would say. And to understand this, you need to look at the Soviet intentions, generally speaking. What is it that the Soviets want at that particular time? And you need to look at communism and how communism had evolved. So under Lenin, the whole idea was that communism needs to spread, and it would spread very, very quickly. You'd have world revolution by the mid-20s. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen. So you then have under Stalin, you have this idea of communism in one country. However, that does not mean that you're not going to spread and expand at a time of your choosing when it's wise to do so. And of course, to Stalin, the perfect setting for this is the outbreak of World War II. There is an argument which says that Stalin signed the treaty with Hitler in 1939 in order to push Hitler over the edge to go to war with with Poland, which would then bring the Western Allies into the war, and that would lead to some sort of refight of the First World War. And that would weaken Western Europe, and that would make it very easy for the Soviets to then advance and to take over all of Europe. And so the argument runs, Stalin, just like everyone else, was very surprised and shocked when he found out, or when he saw that the campaign in the West is over very, very quickly. So you can see there's ideology does play a role. In the long run, there probably was some sort of idea of exporting communism to other countries. Does not mean that that was the case in 1941. Because when you look at the military, the Soviet military at 1941, it simply wasn't ready to do that. So they knew they would have to face the German army. The German army at that stage is very strong, is very experienced. It's just fought the campaign against Poland and defeated the enemy in the West. So fighting a war against these guys is not a good idea. In particular, when you have an army or military that is still weakened from the purges, from the Finnish Winter War. So an immediate attack in 1941 is extremely unlikely. Even though some people have written about this, as you say, mainly in the German case. One famous writer, Gerd Schulze-Ronhoff, for example, has written about a retired general. I would argue not particularly convincing. And when you look at the historiography now, people agree that that was not the case. I would argue in the long run, possible, not in 1941. However, what you do find is that the Soviet military doctrine, generally speaking, of course, argued for an offensive war, which would have to take into the enemy and into enemy territory very, very quickly. And that meant that even at that stage, even though they were not thinking about an invasion of Germany, they had stationed most of their troops relatively close. I don't want to go into exact detail here, relatively close to the German border. And that, of course, was the excuse used on the German side. Say, well, look at that, they're massing here, so we need to go now, otherwise they're going to attack us. So you've got different levels here. My view is in the long run, in the very long run, yes, there might have been perhaps an attack by the Soviet Union, but definitely not in 1941, and that is just not realistic. It's a huge myth that still, doesn't seem to die because it is too convenient.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects that you touched on is something that I was thinking about as well, that the defensive doctrine of the Soviet Union was that, or I should say, the doctrine of the Soviet Union is that the offense is the best defense, right? That doesn't mean they're actually going to attack and invade Germany in 1941. It means that they were prepared and had some case plans and so forth that if Germany attacks them, they will then defend in an offensive way, which they tried to do in 1941. They launched these massive counterattacks in an attempt to break through German lines and penetrate them and so forth, which they're not able to do. And I think that contributes to some of the ideas that they were planning an attack, which I don't think are particularly justified, as you mentioned.
So we've now debunked this myth about the outbreak of the war in the East. But of course, it doesn't stop there. And even in 1941 on the Eastern Front, you've got more of these big myths. And we can perhaps look at one or two additional ones. And one of the other big ones is that when you go to the end of the campaign in 1941, December 1941, that this operation, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, failed at the gates of Moscow because of the winter. And it was only the winter that stopped the German army. And because of the early winter setting in, the German army was not able to conquer Moscow and then bring the war to a victorious end in the East.
So I think what we're going to do for today is leave that question that you raised, Matthias, as a cliffhanger for all of you listeners out there. Apologies, but you know how it is in the attention economy. You've got to keep the expectations high.
How very mean.
But we are going to tackle that myth and the rest of the Barbarossa campaign in 1941 in our next episode. So we will see you then. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Just a second, my phone is vibrating. I need to decline that
Is
call.
it on Pervitin?
Yeah, it's my Pervitin
It's running on
delivery.
Pervitin. Yeah.
Sure.